Danceuse nitotemtik nitsigasa Jaime Koebel. My name is Jaime Koebel and I'm originally from Lac La Biche in Northern Alberta. I've lived in Ottawa for the past 17 years and I'm an artist, an educator, a dancer, and curator. Being a Métis person, what it means to me is that we have a distinct art form. We have many distinct art forms, actually. We have a culture, a language, and lots of stories coming from our background. It includes three very specific ideas to keep in mind. So if we look at the very specific period of time, we're looking at the 17th and the 18th century when Europeans were expanding out into the western part of Canada and met Cree, Ojibwe, and Saulteaux women. During that time, they created families. This was during the fur trade, and those families created a distinct culture, distinct way of life, knowledge with the land, and relationship with the government and amongst their own families. When I moved out to Ottawa, I wanted to make sure that I was able to keep my connection with my community. I didn't realize how much it had become a part of my everyday life until I actually came to Ottawa and we're missing some of those pieces. So the first thing I started with was the dance. And in the dance, we have a lot of stories. And through the stories, it made me think about other art practices, including the traditional practices that combine with artworks. For example, my dad is a fisherman. He's from the Buffalo Lake Metis settlement, and he catches a lot of whitefish. And in catching those whitefish, he's able to tell the health of a fish by looking at its scales. He's able to tell the health of the waters by looking in that fish's eyeballs and anything that would tell him about the health of the total ecosystem in the area. And a practice that I remember growing up as a kid was fish scale art. And this is when some of the artists in the community would take the fish scales that the fisher people would save for the artists. They would dye those scales using a variety of colors from the land. And after drying those scales out, they would manipulate each of the scales by rolling them through their fingers with a little bit of moisture. And once they do that, they arrange those scales on some fabric, and that would make these beautiful flowers. This practice also extends into the beadwork, so we're also known as the flower beadwork people. We do a lot of porcupine quill work and embroidery, so really anything that has to do with flowers was a really important part of our visual imagery. Going back home for me is always a little bit of a surprise, a little bit of a relief, because then I'm reminded of all of the plants that are different in Northern Alberta that I can't see when I come to Ottawa or when I travel around Ontario. And knowing that specific relationship to the environment is important for me as a Métis person, because that's where our traditional Indigenous knowledge comes from. This includes when many First Nations people talk about the four medicines. Even though we use sweetgrass, we use tobacco, we use sage, we don't necessarily use cedar. What we do use is a fungus that comes from a diamond willow tree. And this is like our fourth medicine. And knowing where those medicines come from and that it only really comes from that part of the whole world is important for me as an Indigenous person, because that means that knowledge should be carried on. And if that's my land and my community, then that's a responsibility that I have to share that in a way that's going to keep it safe. So even though I live far away from my community, I'm still able to keep a connection to my people and my community through doing more research, going back home, and sharing what I can with children and adults here in Ottawa and across the country. Traditional knowledge informing my art practice has something that really helps for me to keep my connection to my community. And one of those practices is through birch bark biting, which includes harvesting birch bark so that we're taking the birch bark in a respectful way and we take it horizontally as opposed to vertically so that it can grow back with this fungus on top of the sort of scab or the scar that the tree ends up getting, and it can heal itself. What we do with that birch bark once we get it is we peel it off into these really thin sheets, and those thin sheets will be folded up into little triangles, and then we'll put that in our mouth and we'll bite these little designs over various parts of that triangle, open it, and maybe we might refold it, bite it again. Once we totally bring it open, we'll have a flower there. And what I love about this art practice is that it's not just only about aesthetics, but we know that biting birch will also help us with our vitamins. We can boil that after, and it helps us drink maskigi mapoi, which is our medicine water or our tea. And the birch bark biting practice teaches us to respect our environment, teaches us to give thanks to the environment. As we're peeling the birch bark off, we're putting down tobacco to give thanks for what Mother Earth can provide. And we're also singing songs, so that's a way to honor the birch tree with its bark. I first came up with the idea of superhero plant trading cards when I was drawing individual plants and thinking about the medicinal qualities that each of the plants have. And growing up as a kid and walking around with my grandma and listening to her talk about the different plants was something that I remembered for a really long time, not just as a special moment with my grandmother, but for some of the healing practices that our people have implemented over the years, and that all of those healing practices are connected to our environment and to the plants. For instance, if one of the plants had the power, like a chicory plant, where you would soak it in the water and splash it on your face, and that would clear out some of the debris from your eyes, I would use that as a way of instilling in that plant their superpower of extra vision, and so they can maybe see really, really, really far, or they would have powerful dreams. And connecting these types of amazing skills to the plants really, for me, was a way to bring up the importance of their powers, and a fun way to make traditional Indigenous knowledge relevant, and want people to go out searching and have a real appreciation for how it grows and how one plant can have a certain power just by growing beside another plant. How you can find a poison in one plant and the remedy growing right next to it. And to me, those were like, you know, villains, and they were the good guys and the bad guys, and those were ways for me to share my traditional Indigenous knowledge. And having young people see themselves in these plants and the powers that they wish they could have, and finding those that they exist in plants, and creating a bit of empowerment once they're creating those superhero cards, where they can really see themselves as being a superhero.